Hello, welcome back. I'm Dr. Feist. I'm still talking about the Nicomachean Ethics, but not for much longer because we're finally coming to the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's almost all over. Chapters 7 to 9. Wrap up, transition. Think wrap up and transition. What do I mean by that? Wrap up. Chapter 7, eudaimonia, activity of soul. We've seen this in accordance with arete. Highest arete. That's what we're looking at now. Activity of the best part of us. Right? So it's a human activity, the best part, the intrinsically human. What's the best part of us? Well, the best part of us is going to be that part of us that engages with the highest, the best part of reality. The most noble. What's the most noble in reality? It's not physical stuff. It's higher stuff. Playing chess, thinking about numbers, thinking about divinities and all that kind of stuff. So these higher level things, how do we reach this? It's not through the body, at least according to Aristotle. It's not a physical interaction with the world. Yeah, there's hedone and that, and he's not saying don't do any of that. Remember, Aristotle is not saying don't have any fun. He never says that. He just says don't think that bodily pleasures are the highest forms. That's where you get into trouble. And remember, way back in the moral virtues, it was all about controlling that, controlling your emotions, and learning to be temperate, and worrying about prudence and things like that. So it's okay to do that stuff, but not as a sole goal in life. So how do we engage with the best part of reality? Well, he says basically it's via contemplation. Right? The road to the best part of reality is through our minds and our thoughts. That's how you engage with that's how you do the highest forms of activity of soul, is really thinking. So contemplation is the key element in our old friend eudaimonia. So what are we talking about really with the best life, the real life of happiness? It's going to be this highest pleasure, this highest thing we can do, engaging with the highest, everything highest, all over the place. That's the best life according to Aristotle. It's going to have the highest hedone, the highest pleasure is going to be really in the realm of thought, contemplation. So philosophy, pursuit of wisdom, this is the highest we can get. This is the most, as Aristotle would say, that's truly being the most human that you can be, is to engage in that. Not in the bodily stuff, that's more like animals. And again, that's fine, but that's not the highest thing you can do. That's not the greatest and the highest. It may, and Aristotle, is he talking about this as the most intense? Like, wouldn't you say, well, bodily pleasures, those tend to be the most intense? Well, you might want to argue about that, but Aristotle is not necessarily saying that highest is like most intense or something like that. He's just talking about highest as in terms of like most valuable. And what's interesting is the most valuable turns out to be one thing that you actually use the least because it's not done for the sake of anything further. So the notion of value is not connected directly to use all the time in Aristotle. Today we tend to connect value and use, like when we say if something's valuable, we usually say, well, what's it good for, right? And Aristotle might say, well, nothing, and that's what makes it so extremely valuable. So that's always good to think about. How we link concepts up may not be the way that Aristotle did. And that's another sort of reason why I say be careful about using modern language all the time for translating ancient Greek terms, because when we have modern understandings, we do link concepts up in a way that can be very misleading for us when we try to interpret Aristotle. All right, so all this, go with the highest, go with high, all that stuff. Ultimately, what Aristotle is saying, if I can put it in a little bit of a catchphrase, if you really want to be happy, you're trying to be like a god. And in the Middle Ages, there were all kinds of tracts and things written on, the imitation of Christ, imitation of gods. That's an old thing, but you find it in Aristotle. How are you supposed to be like a god? Not like Zeus and the gang, because they weren't exactly the most respectable bunch. So that's not what Aristotle really means. But he nonetheless encourages us to be like a God, and we'll look in a moment here more of what he means by that. But his sort of be like a God is to, work at developing the highest part of yourself, the most noble part, purest, that is your thought, your intellect. That's ultimately the best part of you. Like the greatest part of you is your intellect. All right, so that's essentially what he's getting at in chapter 7. So on to chapter 8. Here we have a little bit of a shift, because we've talked about in chapter 7 all the important thing, the highest part. Aristotle, you might be thinking, what happened to all that other stuff about moral virtue, and where'd those all go? This seems to be all more intellectual stuff. Well, he returns in chapter 8. He says, look, the life of moral virtue is still important. It's extraordinarily important. He's not denying that. He's just saying it's not the highest part. So, in other words, you can think of the life of moral virtue as kind of a secondary version of eudaimonia. It's a really purely human notion, where this one is has this kind of divine sort of notion in it, because you're trying to be like a God. You're trying to imitate. Here, you're really it's purely human. It's less independent, as Aristotle says, to do these acts of moral virtue. You got to be out there. You got to be interacting with people. You got to have some kind of support system. You got to have good health. You got to have a little bit of money, a little bit of power in society, etc., etc. You want to do good things, you need some things in order to do good things. Good things as in this life of moral virtue. So it's related, as Aristotle said, and remember he has those levels of purity, this life of moral virtue is more related to our bodily side, our compositional nature, as Aristotle says. So this is like more of the material of our bodies that is associated with the life of moral virtue. Again, it's extremely important. It's part of eudaimonia, but it's not the highest part. So the question is what kind of a conceptual structure does eudaimonia have? And that's been debated a lot by various philosophers. Is it inclusive, or is it something separate? How does this all work? The text isn't entirely clear and doesn't give definitive answers. And so people try to parse it out and make arguments for one version of eudaimonia over the other. In any case, Aristotle says, okay, back to the gods. Consider the gods. They enjoy eudaimonia. Their blessed happiness is there. And so we now have this notion of eudaimonia is going to be linked up with this notion of blessedness, being like a god. And so we bring in the term of makaria rather than just eudaimonia. So that's an interesting and puzzling kind of link. But in any case, consider the gods. They enjoy eudaimonia. But Aristotle says, yeah, they're happy and all that, but that seems a little ridiculous and silly if we think of the gods as enjoying eudaimonia because they're virtuous and they do virtuous things like entering into contracts and doing all doing human activities. In that sense, Aristotle thinks that's kind of ridiculous. So they don't do virtuous things or actions. No. So when we talk about being like a god, how would you do that? You're not being like a god. And this is where Aristotle is quite different than maybe some contemporary versions of religion, especially, when we do talk about being, like a god or whatever, you're doing all these good things. That's not how Aristotle sees it. Because the gods don't really do stuff like that. How to be most like a god? Not through our actions, not through praxis. That's not really what he thinks is going to get you closer to being like a god. Really, how to be most like a god, once again, the root is contemplation. Animals, of course, they can't do this stuff at all. So animals maybe can be nice to each other or whatever, we interpret it that way, and maybe they can honestly be benevolent or things like that, but they don't have this root to being like a god, and that root, of course, runs through the mind, that part of our soul that Aristotle would refer to mostly as the intellect. All right, so we've got this sort of dualistic version of eudaimonia where it's sort of this contemplative thing, that's the highest. The secondary is with moral virtue. All right, are we done? Chapter 9, the final chapter of chapter 10, so right at the tail end. Aristotle says, more or less, are we done? And no, we're not. He says, this is really laying the groundwork. This is the beginning. What we have in chapter 9 is an extended sort of discussion, what we could call the transition to the politics. So we often publish Aristotle, these books separately, that, the Nicomachean Ethics is often studied independently of the politics. But really, from what Aristotle says, it seems that they're all of a piece. Really, you should always read these together, because he thinks in the end, what our goal is not to just have a theoretical understanding. So you don't just stop at the end of book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics and go, good, I now have an understanding of the whole notion of virtue, and maybe I have an understanding of the complexity of the structure of the concept of eudaimonia, and I can talk a lot about it and do fancy lectures, and that's not the point, right? It's important to get a theoretical understanding, but that's not really, it's not really the main point, is to just have that. So that's something that you get, and you want to move on into the domain of action again. So that does come back at the end, and Aristotle says, okay, what's going to lead to virtuous action? Well, we've seen a couple things already. Remember way at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle said, I can't teach you anything about virtue and morality and all that stuff if your parents didn't do their job in the first place. So, what do I need? In order to get to virtuous action, we need good teaching, but we have to start off with good parents. But parents can't do it all, Aristotle says. Parents don't have that kind of authority. He recognized that kids don't always listen to their parents. And as they get older, they stop listening, and then they start listening. Things change over time, of course. But basically, Aristotle said that's not going to be good enough. Just the family structure alone is not sufficient. We need something with a little more teeth in it, a little bit more of a broader reach, and ultimately, this more teeth, more broader, Aristotle says you really need a kind of state structure. You're not going to get happy, productive, good citizens simply on the basis of the family. That's not sufficient. That's the start. It's a necessary condition for a good community, is to have good families. Yeah, we can probably safely conclude that on the basis of Aristotle's view, that it's a kind of backbone. And of course, Aristotle will go on in the Politics to describe what he thinks that backbone looks like. And that's highly contestable, like all of this is highly contestable. But that's his point so far, is that the good family structure is necessary, but we need to augment it and flesh it out and develop it with state structure. So we've got kind of the family individual understanding of eudaimonia. How are we really going to produce people like this? It's not enough to just read books. You need a state structure. So for us, we're not, as much as we want to be like the gods, we want to imitate them, that's great. We do, as Aristotle says, have kind of a little bit of the divine in us, right? So we can use that. That's where it clashes maybe a little bit with his earlier discussions of the good man, which seemed a very concrete notion. Now Aristotle's talking about this highest life is contemplation, which seems to be very non-corporeal, very removed from all of society. So there's a bit of tension in there with the notion of the good man and the divine element in all of us. The very concrete, non-idealized person being that to whom we go for judgments, and then this individual notion of a divine element. So there's a little bit of tension there, to say the least. But Aristotle says, at the end of it all, we are still human beings. We are political animals, zoon politikon, political animals. We have to live in communities. Only regular non-human animals live outside of communities, and gods, they can live outside. But the rest of us, we only become real human beings in the context of communities. So the only place that you could actually experience eudaimonia, Even all this stuff about being like a god and all that, you're not really a god. You might have a part of a kind of divinity in you, like a little spark or something, as some of the ancients would talk about. But in order for that spark to really develop, it's got to be in a community. So how do you talk about a community? Well, that's this higher level of understanding, this broader subject, this master subject. Think back to the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. The master subject, as Aristotle said, is that which looks at ultimate ends. That's politics. And so on that note, eudaimonia is only going to be achieved through a political type of structure, which will sort of, you can think of it as subsuming the good parents and all the state structure, and ultimately can produce citizens that are happy, capable of eudaimonia, and good citizens and a good community. So that brings, finally, all this discussion, preliminary, I admit, of the eudaimonia, of eudaimonia, all the tensions associated, and basically the Nicomachean Ethics. So stay tuned for the next video, where I'll start with an overview of essentially what is the second part of Aristotle's study of human beings, the politics. Stay tuned.